Henry and I are really excited to be here with you today to talk about our research on weaponized interdependence. The goal of the talk is really to do three things. First is to walk through the nuts and bolts of the argument. Second is to talk about how weaponized interdependence is transforming world politics. And third is to open up a research agenda, one that we hope you and we can all be a part of. Henry and I are really excited to be here with you today to talk about our research on weaponized interdependence. The goal of the talk is to do three things. First, we want to walk through the nuts and bolts of the argument. Second, we want to think about how weaponized interdependence is transforming world politics. And third, we want to open up a research agenda, one that we hope we can all be a part of. The original article was published in International Security in July 2019. And when Henry and I were thinking about writing this piece, our primary focus was US and European interactions on a number of issues. First was the Iran sanctions, and also the revelations that were made public by Edward Snowden about transatlantic surveillance. And since we began researching this, a series of events have made this, we think, even more important for scholars and policymakers, including the rise of China and conflict between the US and China over technology, the technology sector, as well as the coronavirus and its implication for global supply chains. At the heart of the argument is really thinking through what are the consequences of the global networks that have proliferated really since the 1980s. Networks for information flows like the internet, financial flows, as well as production networks have all transformed the way we live and the way the economy functions. At the same time, as scholars, I think we haven't fully grasped the way in which these global economic networks have transformed international politics. There's a standard story out there, one that probably you're very familiar with. It was first introduced by Thomas Friedman. He had an article and then a book that's called The World is Flat, where he described these networks as not walls but webs. And the basic idea was global economic networks decentralized power. They opened up networks to individuals, firms. He had a theory about the Dell theory of peace, that anybody that was in Dell's logistics operation would never go to war with each other. It painted a very happy picture of a win-win that could happen as global economic networks spread their web throughout the world. Unfortunately, we see that's not exactly what's happened. Whether it's conflict between the US and China over the technology sector, secondary sanctions that have been unleashed against Iran, or even smaller powers like Japan and South Korea getting into fights with each other over super specialized chemicals that are used in the semiconductor industry. What we see is that global economic networks are not just leading to peace and the diffusion of power, but also to coercive potential from very powerful states. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of our argument, we just want to run through the kind of high-level takeaways. The first is that economic networks, they often centralize exchange into key hubs in networks. So rather than the vision of the world is flat, you often have a hierarchy where there are a few key private actors in global economic networks where all information or finance or production flow through. The second point is that this topography, this map of global economic networks, offers unique coercive potential for a few privileged states, especially the United States. And third, this is leading to a new phase of interaction in global economic politics, one in which states are fighting back. They're trying to insulate themselves. How should they respond as privileged states use global economic networks for coercive power? Before getting into our argument, it's important to just remember that there were a set of economic liberals who had a very different interpretation of what was going to happen as global economics networks spread their webs across the world. And these arguments, we would argue, fundamentally misread the map or the structure that underpins globalization. If you look back at Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat, or more recent work such as Anne Marie Slaughter's The Chessboard and the Web, you see a very particular understanding of the structure behind global economic networks. For them, they were decentralized and open-ended, much like this map in the middle of streetlights at night. This map represents what we would call a typical mesh network, one in which there are endless possibilities of how to get from one place in the map to another. But as you know from most cities, this is actually not how street maps work. If you are in Washington, D.C., for example, you often end up crushed in DuPont Circle at that central point in the city as all the key streets converge in one place. In fact, many networks, and particularly global economic networks, are not decentralized, but rather they are asymmetric. That means that there are certain points in the network that are far more connected than others. This is an insight that we draw from work in sociology and computational network analysis. And the core argument behind weaponized interdependence is that the structure of globalization is not flat, but rather hierarchical. To get an idea about how this asymmetry works, take a look at this map. This is the map for Delta's routing system. And what you quickly notice is that most flights depend on using the Atlanta hub. And this is great, especially if you like 20,000 different varieties of Coke products. But if there's an ice storm in Atlanta, the entire system quickly shuts down. And what we want you to get out of this rather anodyne example is that not all nodes in a network are equal. And some nodes, like the Atlanta hub, are extremely important for the functioning of the entire network. So how does this happen? Well, network theorists offer a whole series of mechanisms that can be at play. It might just be about efficiency. Having a central hub makes it easier to organize very complex interactions. Think about the Delta hub. It can also be about power. Google, for example, has a near monopoly in search, and one way that it reinforces this is by purchasing competitors. But it can also be about preferential attachment. This is the idea that some network position, a hub, has value for all the participants. Think about Facebook and its tremendous social network presence. Well, other people decide to join because Facebook already offers a lot of value to those that participate in its network. We don't really take a stake in how this happens, but all of these different mechanisms should lead us to expect that many networks are not decentralized and flat, but in fact have these hierarchies and points of centralization in them. Now we need to shift gears a little bit in the argument. Up until now, we've been talking primarily about the structure of economic networks, how private actors form global economic networks that have these points of centralization or hubs. Now we want to think about how states can leverage that structure for their own coercive potential. And in particular, we're going to think about two strategies that privileged states can use in order to expand their power. And that is what we call the panopticon effect and the choke point effect. And states are able to do that when they have some jurisdiction over these key hubs in global economic networks. The first strategy we want to talk about is the panopticon effect. Here we're drawing on work by Jeremy Bentham. He was an 18th century philosopher who had a particular notion of how you could build a prison. Here you would have a central watchtower in a circular room, and it would allow the prison to just have one guard who would be able to monitor all of the inmates. Michel Foucault then expanded on this notion and suggested that the prisoners would police themselves because they would know that they were under such surveillance. And in our world, in the world of weaponized interdependence, the central watchtower are the private actors. So think about Facebook or JP Morgan. They have all the information of all their clients. And what the state can then do is to port into those private actors and glean all of their information in order to know about their adversaries and how they are conducting their business. And having that detailed information allows them to have a watchful eye on the world. The second strategy we call the choke point effect. And here, states are not trying to leverage information that's flowing through these hubs, but instead they're trying to limit access of their adversaries to the global economic networks. Here in the picture, you see a very standard choke point in a physical world. It's the bridge that connects Venezuela and Colombia. But in our version of weaponized interdependence, the access that's being controlled is not just cross borders, but it's to the global economic networks for information, finance, and production. And when adversaries lose access to that, it's not just that they can't trade with another state, but they really start to be unable to trade with the world. Now we want to move into a few examples of how weaponized interdependence is happening. We're going to walk you through the examples that were in the original paper, but we see new cases of this happening every day, whether it's US and China clashing over 5G or South Korea and Japan over specialized chemicals that are used in semiconductors. We want to start with an example that deals with the internet and global information technology. Many, when they think about the internet, they think of it as a very decentralized, fragmented, and highly complex space. There's a famous quip by Bill Clinton who said, trying to regulate the internet was like trying to nail Jello to the wall. And what we're going to show in just these next few slides quickly is that actually there are key points of centralization in the internet, and that allowed the US government to conduct an unparalleled global surveillance operation. These buildings sit just outside of Washington, D.C., and they represent a key hub in the global information infrastructure. They are the server farms for Amazon Web Services, and a tremendous amount of global web traffic pass through them every day. There are other physical choke points or hubs in the global internet. Think about the fiber optic cables that connect the Atlantic to the Pacific or the transatlantic space. In addition to the physical cables and the server farms, you also have a few key companies, kind of monopoly players like Amazon or Google or Facebook, who control a tremendous amount of information flows. The key point is that rather than a complex soup of individuals holding laptops, the internet is really organized through just a handful of key physical locations and corporations. We know, because of the revelations made public by Edward Snowden, that this centralization, these key points in the global internet, became a target for the NSA, the National Security Agency. Programs like Stormbrew and Prism, with other cryptic names, they relied on the fact that information was being pushed through a few key choke points in order to glean tremendous information about terrorist activity and also other adversaries. And for us, it's a great example of how weaponized interdependence works, and particularly the panopticon strategy. But this is far from an isolated case. If you look in global finance, you see this happening in other domains as well. In the middle of this picture, you see the organization SWIFT. Although most people don't even really know that this organization exists, it's the heart of global finance. SWIFT is an organization that sits in Belgium, and it provides a secure messaging system. Basically, any bank or broker-dealer, insurance company, if they want to make a global transaction, it flows through SWIFT. SWIFT is the channel that communicates from one provider to the other and say, this transaction's ready to go. Well, that also means that SWIFT has a record of all of those transactions. This hub position puts it in a treasure trove of information about the global economy. After the attacks of September 11th, officials across the US government started to think, how can they respond? What can they do to help make the United States more safe? And Treasury, in particular, they woke up and thought about SWIFT. Here's a quote from Juan Zarate. He was one of the Treasury Department officials responsible for this domain in the wake of September 11th. And he argues, Access to SWIFT data would give the United States government a method of uncovering never-before-seen financial links, information that could unlock important clues to the next plot or allow an entire support network to be exposed and disrupted. And the Treasury Department, they secretly gave subpoenas to SWIFT demanding data about terrorist activity and other adversaries. And this secret program was then revealed in 2006 by an expose by the New York Times. For us, it's a great example of the panopticon effect, where the US government had jurisdiction over SWIFT and its operations and used that to glean key information for geostrategic ends. But the US government didn't just target SWIFT for information. They also started to think about how they could choke off access to the SWIFT system to put pressure on adversaries. This became really apparent in the run-up to the Iran deal that happened in the 2010s. And here's a quote from the former CEO of SWIFT. "Disconnecting banks is an extraordinary and unprecedented step for SWIFT. It's a direct result of international and multilateral action to intensify financial sanctions against Iran. The United States, in cooperation with the European Union, they forced SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks from the SWIFT system. And as a result, it created tremendous economic pressure on Iran. Because once you're disconnected from SWIFT, you're basically disconnected from the global economy." Up to this point, we've reviewed the key ideas from the original article. First, that global economic networks are often centralized and hierarchical. And second, that this structure of global economic networks provides new opportunities for states, new coercive potential as they engage in their geostrategic interests. In particular, the strategy of using global economic networks for either the panopticon or the choke point effect. We now want to shift gears and think about the research agenda moving forward. The first step is to map the global economic networks. If you think back to the liberal claim, they argued that global economic networks are flat and decentralized, networks represented by image A and D. Our claim is more aligned with the images presented in C and F, with a centralized network. So a key step of the research agenda is to go map the empirical networks. If you think about the oil market, for example, most people think it's a spot market with many buyers and sellers. At the same time, there are payment systems. Most oil exchange goes through the US dollar, so the oil market might be flat, but the payment market might be centralized. Second, we need to think about how this coercive power can be activated. Most of our argument in the original paper was about the structural condition of weaponized interdependence. When could a privileged state use the panopticon effect or the choke point effect? But in everyday politics, it's not always clear that states will use that structural power. In the original article, we thought in particular about two things. First, how domestic institutions may be a key resource that states need to leverage that structural power. If you think about the case of sanctions and secondary sanctions, the US has a tremendous amount of institutional capability in OFAC, the Office for Foreign Asset Control. It's something that knows about how these markets work, and it also knows about the legal tools to implement sanctions. If you contrast that with the European Union, for example, they lack that kind of centralized institutional expertise to do the same kind of policymaking. Similarly, we think about domestic norms and how they may allow or prevent the use of hubs for either panopticons or choke points. In the case of the internet space, for example, we argue that the United States norm of free speech really prevented the US government from using the choke point during the period after 9/11. Finally, we think it's really important to consider the role that private actors play in compliance with the demands of these privileged states. How and when can private actors resist being deployed as pawns in the weaponized interdependence game? Take Apple, for example. After 9/11, they were a partner in the US effort to conduct global surveillance. But a few years later, in 2009, there was an attack in San Bernardino, and Apple resisted making the phones accessible to the US government. And in fact, they instituted really strong new encryption technology. And here we think it's a good example of how companies, they are not just passive in weaponized interdependence, but they are part of how the state can deploy this coercive power. Third, it's really important to consider how states are pushing back. What are the target states' options? Do they just have to submit to either panopticon strategies or choke point effects, or can they try to wiggle out from under the grip of these privileged states? Jack Lew, the former Treasury Secretary, he was very concerned that the excessive use of secondary sanctions in particular might lead to insulation strategies or efforts by target states to nibble away at the plumbing of US power. We already see this happening, at least anecdotally, in relations between Turkey and Russia, where they've developed ruble-based exchange systems that try to circumvent or hide from the traditional panopticon or seeing eye of US dollar exchanges. And that's where we think it's important to move from a static model of weaponized interdependence, which is largely what we did in the original paper, to a dynamic model. So instead of a snapshot, thinking about how this type of network power evolves over time. And a key argument we would make is that these networks are not immutable, that they do change. And so then the question is, when will network centralization break down? When do we think you'll see a competing hub emerge to, for example, the US dollar? We think it's quite unlikely right now to see it with the US dollar in particular, but in other areas, like in the internet space, you already see China emerging as a key provider of core technologies. What alternatives do target states have? Do they retaliate with other network tools? Do they try to insulate themselves by cutting themselves off from those centralized networks? Or do they create counter networks? Think, for example, of China. After the SWIFT campaign by the US and the European Union, they created their own SWIFT alternative, a separate SWIFT system that could be deployed, perhaps, if they were ever targeted. And finally, I think it's important to think about the alternatives that firms have, how they can either insulate themselves or perhaps decouple from instances of US or other countries using weaponized interdependence. And clearly the response to weaponized interdependence does not need to stay at the network level. We already see examples of asymmetric escalation. That's cases where a target state does not just respond with network tools, but physical coercion. This is an alleged example here where the US has blamed Iran for blowing up tankers in the Straits of Hormuz. And why are they doing that? Well, it's because of US use of weaponized interdependence. And because Iran doesn't have those tools, it can resort to physical escalation instead. As we consider this dynamic model, or the way that weaponized interdependence evolves over time, it's really important to remember that there's not one global economic network. Instead, we have many networks for finance, networks for information, for supply chains, and often they interact. If you take the example of 5G, 5G is the next generation of information technology that will allow mobile internet to function. Well, this battle is really heating up between the United States and China over the company Huawei. Huawei is providing the core technology in many countries of 5G. Well, the United States is trying to prevent Huawei from having this hub position in the global economy, and the way that they're doing that is not through information networks, but rather they're using the US key role in both supply chains and in finance in order to put pressure on Huawei. And so what you see here is the interaction of global economic networks and the ways in which states weaponize certain networks in order to affect others. Fourth, we think it's critical that policymakers come up with a set of rules of the road to manage weaponized interdependence. In a recent article in Foreign Affairs, we put this under the banner of managing chain globalization. This is the idea that globalization generates tremendous welfare benefits for the countries involved, but we must recognize that it also creates new vulnerabilities. It's easy then to leverage these vulnerabilities against your adversaries to take advantage of weaponized interdependence. But in the long term, doing that could both threaten globalization and it also might create new forms of escalation. And so we believe that policymakers need to think about responsibly using weaponized interdependence, doing things like avoiding antagonizing key hubs, thinking about using weaponized interdependence in a rules-based way with clear objectives. If you're interested in this conversation, we urge you to check out the Foreign Affairs article because it presents some initial thoughts on how policymakers might use weaponized interdependence in a responsible way. In conclusion, we'd like to review some of the key insights from the talk. First is the idea that global economic networks are often asymmetric. Rather than being decentralized, global economic exchange often flows through a few key global economic hubs. And these hubs become a key site of control for states, privileged states, who can access them. They offer these states both the panopticon effect and the choke point effect. Second, in a new world of interdependence, security must be rebalanced against efficiency. For much of the 1990s, there was a lot of talk about win-wins and how markets should rule. But we're seeing the vulnerabilities that this reliance on markets generates, and states are coming in very quickly to reassert their security interests. Third, policymakers need a strategic understanding of the benefits and drawbacks of using weaponized interdependence. Weaponized interdependence is a very seductive tool. There are no boots on the ground, and it seems so easy to leverage them. But increasingly, we're seeing pushback, and we're also seeing the tensions that it generates with allies as we put them in the stranglehold of these tools. Thanks again for having us here today. If you're interested in weaponized interdependence and like to learn more, check out our website, weaponizedinterdependence.com, follow us on Twitter at WorldWeaponized, or check out a series of podcasts that are available about the topic. One's listed here on the slide, and there's more on our website. Thanks again.